I'm the what was that? The Tasmanian devil. That's it. Welcome to the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast. This is the podcast where we work to dissect and analyze the epic, the amazing, the awe-inspiring, the cool, the awesome power of storytelling and learn how to harness that power in your everyday lives. I'm Gaurav.
And I'm Kevin.
You know, Kev, we were at Captain America's house last night and we were talking to his brother, and he asked us a stoicism question, which I loved. His brother is very philosophical and deep guy. He's a great guy to talk to. I mean, he asked us the question, do you think you can be a patient person without having your patience tested? It was along the lines of that question. And it's a very stoicism question, and it's this idea that to build any muscle, to build any skill, you have to face adversity in it, right? It's like going to the gym. You're not going to have muscles unless you put your body under that tension, unless you put your body under that stress, right? So, can you become a patient person without having your patience tested? And it's an interesting storytelling question. One, it's about this idea of using this as a mechanism to own and celebrate your past problems and your past mistakes, because you're like, it's that classic, those were all lessons, right? I faced that so I can become better at this. And then the other idea about this that I want to explore a little bit more is something that's come up a lot since we first came up on our show with Dr. Andrea Letamendi, the idea of parasocial relationships, how stories like mythology, like superheroes, allows us to build these fictional parasocial relationships with fictional characters and experience things in a psychologically safe way, which allows us to learn some of these lessons without having to actually go through them.
Yeah, I think we see a lot of stories utilizing this mechanism to be able to showcase, a certain quality of a character. For someone to become the hero, you need to put them through the trials.
We learn a lot about the world through diverse stories. We learn a lot about what patience means through the shows we watched as a kid. We create these connections with these characters and see how they experience things, and we learn what to do and what not to do by the stories we consume. So when we ask ourselves, do we have to test our patience? I think yes, we do. It happens, and all the things we've gone through has helped us. But I also think all the stories we've consumed has helped us. It helps us define that word. It helps us broaden our definition. Anyways, Kev, who are we talking to today?
Well, speaking of celebrating lived experiences and understanding your past, today we are joined by an author who has debuted with her memoir, Private Equity. Our expert storytelling for the week is Carrie Sun. In her debut memoir, Private Equity, Carrie narrates her experience working as assistant to the billionaire founder of one of the top Wall Street hedge funds. It is a journey where she discovers all the ins and outs of working in high finance, understanding how her backgrounds and upbringing shaped her into who she was, and eventually her journey of understanding herself, discovering the next chapter of her life, and eventually leaving her position. This is a really engaging and intriguing conversation about Carrie's own journey, storytelling lessons from writing her memoir, and understanding her own past. So let's get started.
Hello, how do you do? Sit down, gather around. We've got stories about stories that'll mix you a drink of wonder and mystique. Cause life can be dry, better dressed for the times with the linen suit and plastic tie. Linen suit and plastic tie. Now here's Gaurav and Kevin.
Can you tell us what are some of your personal favorite stories or mediums of storytelling and why you like them?
Thank you, Kevin and Cora, for inviting me onto your podcast. I have always been so interested in storytelling. And when I was little and reading books, a lot of books and even the nonfiction books that I read all have stories within them. But I would always flip to usually the back cover and read the autobiography or the author bio first, because I am just really interested in how an author came to be in the position of writing this book in the first place. And so that's kind of a meta story of how the book came to be, and how the author came to be and how did this person come to tell the story. And so um I have some of my favorite stories are I'm just thinking in terms of ones that were pertinent to my book, but like The Wire, I don't know if you know the television show.
Yep.
I took so many storytelling techniques from The Wire. I'm kind of obsessed with that show. And so I looked to The Wire to like, how can I string together scenes and anecdotes and have it feel like a whole? But also, I look to literary fiction, and I know the first epigraph I have in my book is from Ishiguro about remains of the day, and that was probably the book that I looked to the most in terms of storytelling as a way to understand my own story, because that book, even though it's entirely fictive, is about a person, Mr. Stevens, who completely devotes his entire life to work, and how he then comes to term with his own story, as it were, right? So it's actually the memoir of Mr. Stevens, and he's trying to wrestle with his own past and history on the page. And so those are, I mean, I just look to storytelling inspiration in so many different parts of the industry.
It's really interesting. I think you brought up so many really cool things. One thing I loved right off the bat was this idea that you kind of wanted to know the narrative and the story behind the storyteller, like what makes that person tick, what led to this story, what led to this book. You read the parts of the book that everyone skips. Did that give you a lot of insight to why people are making decisions through storytelling? Has that affected the way you read the books, or is this a curious thing?
Great question. I think it helps me understand more fully the context in which the story came to be. I both like to completely just read the text as if I, don't have any other information, but I find that knowing the author behind the work, so, I guess I don't really believe in death of the author, but it just helps me feel like, I'm really interested in not just the story itself, but the craft of storytelling and how stories are able to be pushed through culture, and what kind of stories other people really respond to. And this is a little bit separate from kind of just the commercial market side of things. It's actually just what about the story is connecting with people on it, because I really think it is through stories that you can capture the imagination, and I think there is a possibility of true change. I believe stories have the power to change people's minds and make them believe in the future. And so I am interested in kind of the whole context around how these stories came to be.
Well, that's exactly why we do this show. We believe that the most persuasive politicians, people, are storytellers. If you can't tell it in a story, no one's going to listen. Some of the smartest people are not great storytellers, and that's why we know nothing about quantum physics. I'm kidding, of course. There's a few
Yes,
people out there that know something about quantum physics, I'm sure.
exactly. I also think, in some senses, the author bio the author bio can be said to be sort of a storytelling CV, or at least how they got to be in a position to be able to publish and share this story. And so to that end, I think a lot about how stories are so relevant to career and resume, because in my book I started off in quantitative finance. I was actually working on the investment side in quantitative finance. Then I switched to sort of a more support role for hedge fund billionaires, multiple of them. And so that's more of a support, but also I think the roles would now in this day and age be categorized as more of a chief of staff role. And then I'm on kind of my third career now of being a full-time author. My author bio has a lot of pivots and changes, but part of the reason I was able to make those changes successfully is I was able to kind of tell a story of why those changes meant something to me and who I am. And I was able to convey that in all the interviews that I did, for the job. In the book, it was 14 interviews, but, at my next job, it was, I don't know, at least 6, so to be able to tell your story is so important. And then, this is my first published book, my debut. And I think part of that is also being able to tell a story of why I need to tell this story. So that's kind of a meta storytelling aspect, but how you're able to tell your story is so important to be able to have, I guess people will call it a platform or, some avenue to be able to share your work.
And kind of with that in mind, before we get into the book, we also want to quickly understand your author's bio, from your own perspective. Obviously, the book is a memoir, but can you give us your own author's bio? What is your story?
Right. So I'm Carrie Sun, and I'm right now a full-time author. And once upon a time, I was a quant. I worked on Wall Street. After I was quant, I worked for 2 major hedge fund billionaires, and I really helped them run their lives. And I quit the world of high finance in 2018 to get an MFA in creative writing because I really wanted to learn just the craft side of how to be able to become a writer. And so I graduated in 2020, started working on my book. That's where I am today. But I will say that my love of storytelling is not a new thing. I wrote my first book for myself when I was 8 years old. I technically sort of self-published it. And so that was kind of my first foray into trying to produce something in the story medium. And it took me over 30 years to be able to publish a book. And in that time, I had many detours, working on Wall Street, starting business school, dropping out of business school. But those detours are all part of who I am, and they make me exactly who I am today.
I love that. I mean, we talk about this so much on the show that it's interesting the language we use about detours and lessons and things like that, because like we have so many people who the first thing they say before they answer, we always ask, "What's your story?" And they say, "Well, my story's unique. My story had a lot of twists and turns. Well, my story was not linear." I mean, like none of them are, right? So we use words like detours, and we use words like, I can't think of any other words, but we use words like detours, and we use words like windy and like, well, it wasn't a linear path. Like there is a linear path, and it's that LinkedInified life. So I love when we talk about this, where it's like, even though we all are framing our story based retrospectively, we all still see, this is why I turned left, this is why I turned right.
Exactly. And I do also think about the word detour a lot. And I, don't think of it as a negative. Like, I think I needed to go on those detours. And the only reason I use the word detour now is because the career I have chosen now is one of being a writer and a full-time author. With respect to those set of career values and choices, perhaps being in something else, like, having a day job on Wall Street, don't necessarily give me so many transferable skills and just like even the network effects of helping that career. But let's say in a counterfactual world, if I were to continue on Wall Street and really believed in it, hard for me to imagine. But if I did, then being an author would kind of have been a detour for that, So I think being a detour is always with respect to where you are today and hope to be in the future. But again, I don't think of that as a negative in any way. And but I will say it took me many years, a long time to arrive at that understanding of my own story. Because for a very long time, I think I knew I wanted to be a writer, but I was doing so many other things. Like, I don't come from wealth, so I needed a day job to be able to pay for living expenses, all of these things. I just felt so behind on my journey. With respect to everyone else, I felt so behind, and what was I doing? And I was like, well, I might as well give up because I'll never catch up to everybody. I'll never, have the, background that people who majored in English literature have, and I just felt so incredibly behind. And I felt like I wasted my time doing another career. Only now, writing this memoir, Private Equity, do I realize, like, well, those very, quote, detours that we speak of and that time wasting, it's not just a major integral part of my story, but like it is me. It is my story. I couldn't have done it any other way.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's so many things buzzed for me when you were talking about like that feeling behind. It's something I talk about a lot in therapy. Like, it's this idea, and this is the thing about these amazing institutions have great educational powers. Obviously, so many great people come out of it. I learned a lot at mine. You went to some amazing schools. They're very selective for reasons, but they kind of teach us to be obsessed with youth, right? Society kind of teaches us to be obsessed with youth, and we look at some of these private equities and these VC firms and the Hollywood stories we hear about are the 20th something founder, the person who found it in college, who figured out their whole life apparently, or something, or the part of your life that you're struggling with. There's a kid who figured it out 10 years ago, right? And these are fallacies. These are narratives. These are backwards looking constructions of the one of 5,000 stories we hear about. And it's this taught storytelling of not only are we self-selecting for the one in a million story, but we are so obsessed with youth that everyone just constantly feeling like they should have done it 5 years ago.
Yes, exactly. And I also think in American culture, I love what you just said. Not so there's this career aspect that, of story and your own story that's obsessed with, youth, but also that I think in America there's such a premium placed on knowing yourself with conviction and where you're going. Like somehow like being ambivalent about your career or like just taking the time even to explore yourself and possible paths, somehow that's like almost, at least in the circles I was in, that was almost like frowned upon. Like you should be walking confidently into the recruiting center and knowing exactly what you want to do, like before you've even started college, you're on this track to get internships and consulting or wherever. And so we kind of discount the true resources, time and money, and just resources, emotional resources needed to go on a journey of self-discovery, and I think people are trying to overfit story narratives before they actually live them.
Yeah, I love that we're talking about this process of knowing yourself. And in the memoir, you do show a very comprehensive journey of your own, of self-discovery, and you were willing to be very vulnerable, where you obviously had some difficulties and confusions with that, and to be able to write all that down into a book and publish it, it takes a lot of vulnerability. So can you tell us a little bit about how you arrived at that courage or willingness to be vulnerable?
I'll say that it was extremely difficult. I, just at the beginning, I went through all my personal emails and text messages from those 2.5 years. If anyone has gone through their old text messages and read, their the way they've responded to certain situations, it is just pure cringe. I had to read a little and just like stop. I just like am so ashamed. And it's not even like, it's not even like any of the major things or situations. It's actually just like, oh, I can't believe I missed that red flag. Oh, I can't believe I like said that was okay when it's clearly not okay, And so what was very difficult was this distance between who I was at that time, which was about 10 years ago, and who I am today. But the way I got through that, and it was slow going, extremely slow at first, was just reminding myself that like me feeling this distance and feeling, cringing at my former self and feeling that I was, oh my God, so naive back then. That is the story. I don't have a memoir. I don't have a story if I don't feel that distance. Like if I am the same person I was then as I am now, well, there would be no story because I would never have quit that world. It is literally because I have gone through this very personal journey that I feel complicated and mixed emotions about my former self. And then I have a line from Joe Didion in my head, which is the work of wanting to be on nodding terms with your past self. So instead of judging my past self, I want to nod at her, which is, one of acceptance, one of seeing her clearly, but also just being like, that's who you are and that's great. And, I don't need to forgive everything she's ever done or said, but I also don't need to blame her so harshly and cruelly that I was really judging my former self, And so to be vulnerable in that way was really, really difficult. And, I initially I just wanted to write a story about my coming of age at the workplace. It's really a story about knowing who you are and who you want to be through work. I really wanted to write that story because I hadn't seen that many workplace memoirs told from the perspective of an average worker. So not like, the CEO or like, there are so many billionaire memoirs, and so, but then I realized I couldn't tell that story. I first tried to exclude all the parts that I was sort of feeling somewhat ashamed of and not wanting to share. Even the work story, like like how much I believed in my boss at the beginning. I just like wholeheartedly believed in the possibility of good billionaires. Obviously, I look at that statement now and I want to judge myself because I don't believe in that anymore. But it's also not like I disagree with it entirely. It's more of a nuanced understanding. And arriving at that nuanced understanding is the story in my book. And so, I included the line. I believed in the possibility of good billionaires at the beginning. But also on the personal side, I initially didn't want to talk about my parents that much because I was like, well, that's the personal side of my life. Why would they have anything to do with work? And actually, I realized that my work story didn't really make sense until I went there with the story of my parents. And the work story didn't make sense because, well, what was I doing there? Why was I so kind of justifying these systems I found myself in, even though they were hurtful toward me? And even though I felt like I had no say, even though I felt like I was repressing myself, subjugating myself, completely subordinating everything about me in order to serve this authority figure. And I'm like, oh my God, that's the story I lived with, my parents. And then I would say the last thing that helped me be vulnerable was like, I have chosen this profession, but beyond that, I had to be very clear with myself about what I valued most. And I valued the story and the product of a book way more than I valued looking knowledgeable, looking smart, looking like I knew I was where I was going because I didn't. I just like, I had to put the needs of the story above my own needs of ego. And I just had to remind myself of that every day.
I mean, that's such a hard thing to do, right? I'm just thinking about how like I sometimes struggled not lying to my therapist. So
Yeah.
writing a book
Yeah.
like this, I don't know how it requires incredible amount of vulnerability and character and strength. Something that I found really interesting. Again, you're coming out of like high finance into this state of vulnerability, and something you said right at the end there was struggling not to try to look smart, right?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
is so much of what high finance is, so much of
Yes.
high anything, trying to look like the trusted one in the room, the one that has the answers. That's got to be such a mind shift, right?
Yeah.
Because you're in that environment.
And I have to say on that, I'm like so insightful for you to just pick up on that. It's like, I have well, I'll just give you one example. I have a friend who really I know from my like you just said high performing days of both
Mhm.
being in high finance and being in kind of like the educational elite circles
Mhm.
I was in. And, I'll just say that that person's from that world and doing extremely well. And like he wants to get into writing. And he also loves writing, being a storyteller. And he asked me how he might be able to publish a book. And so I had a lot to say about that. And
Mhm.
but something, and it's these off the cuff comments that tell me so much. He said something. So his LinkedIn, as really, I mean, he does have a LinkedIn, is so just polished. Almost
Oh, so is
entirely
mine.
linear. Yeah, exactly. Just like so, like perfect. And then he goes something about how like no one's going to want to read what he has to say because he hasn't achieved enough. And in literature, at least my own experience of it, I don't want to read about how someone, made, I don't know, X amount of dollars a year and how they succeeded. I actually want to read about like their struggles and how they were imperfect. And, that's what makes them human and kind of these turning points. And I think it's the imperfections and the failures. What LinkedIn can't capture actually is often what makes for the best literature. And so,
Mhm.
I just told him actually, it doesn't matter if you accomplish more or less, whoever you are today. Flannery O'Connor said, if you survived a childhood, you have enough to write about. Like, really. So, we all have enough to write about. It's just how you frame the piece, the story.
Exactly. I mean, this is something I miss about the pandemic that I've been thinking a lot about. Is that we used to give ourselves, and during the pandemic, so much credit for just getting up and going and trying our best. And we kind of stopped a couple
Yeah.
years after, or a year or so after the pandemic. And that kind of sucks because life is traumatic. Life is
Yes.
hard. And being able to give ourselves permission, tell ourselves that story was just magical.
Yes.
So, I mean, you obviously it's a published book, so you obviously worked with editors and teams, and you getting your MFA, you learned how to craft narratives and kind of how to make things. I don't want to say commercial, but commercial, right? Um, what was that process like for working with people to craft an overall narrative and deciding what was essential for the book when it is such a personal story, right? How did
Yes.
that process work, and how was that for you as a whole?
So, especially for memoir, I am very cognizant that actually even the character of Carrie on the page is actually not one to one with who I am today. It is a product I made through being vulnerable, through like extreme adherence to truth, especially emotional truth, because I changed like identifying details and stuff like that in my book. And so it's actually a separate, not just character, but product from me. And so when other people, including, editors, agents who gave me notes and feedback, I loved working with them because again, it's sort of an ego work of like realizing, we're collaborating on this product and what they're critiquing is not who I am, but rather this product that's separate from me. And that is really hard to do because taking feedback at all in any situation is really difficult. And so especially on such a personal topic, it can be like, why didn't you respond to this traumatic thing in a more like understandable way? And it's like, well, I just
Digestible way.
didn't. Exactly. Exactly. And so comments about any of those extremely personal aspects, can be really hurtful. But because I went in, I wouldn't say with a shield. I would say that the Gaurav, as you say, the commercial end of it felt very different from the drafting, writing, and end of it. And when I was writing and producing the manuscript, so in the drafting phase, my editor told me my number one priority, and this is so helpful for me to hear. She said, your number one priority is to protect your own memories. That's it,
Mm.
only. And so, that's not worrying about what other people might think, not also letting other voices taint my own voice and what I believe, But then the manuscript is done and it becomes this, commercial product that other people have input on and other people have invested time, money, energy into. And so as an author, I have to be really clear about, what stage in the process that is and, when I transitioned to the later stage, I was able to, because I have a business background, kind of be more or less unemotional about it because I really just wanted it to be as successful as possible. And again, success is not always defined by commercial ends, but did I write this book that I really can say I feel proud of? And toward the end, when I think I recorded my audiobook a month or two before the publishing date, and when I had to read through my book again, I was honestly fearing a little bit because I was like, what if there are so many things I want to change or I don't want to share with the public, don't want to, or even just hearing my own voice. I was so afraid of the experience actually. And ultimately, I felt actually completely at peace with who I was previously. And that's how I knew that I've written this book that I am actually proud of and do look forward to sharing with the world.
I also like that we're getting to talk about the audio aspect of it because Gaurav and I, we both did listen to the audiobook. So yeah, we both heard the story from your own voice. And I really like where you talked about in the memoir of this little conversation about your own voice, of how you disliked it. And you did also receive compliments from others about your voice. So this is very meta that, you get to actually narrate it. So what was that like to narrate your own memoir? Did that alter or influence your memory?
I love that question, Kevin, because it is so meta, and to be able to talk about your voice, and as you say, even in my book, I talk about hating my voice. So there's a story about the story of my voice, and so in full honesty, I have not listened to my audiobook, and the little bits of it I really currently cannot, and it's not because of the content, but it's actually, I think, just my voice itself is jarring to me, because the voice you hear for yourself in your head is not the same voice that other people hear. But I think that is a perfect metaphor for my difficult relationship with my own voice. As much as other people tell me my voice is great or not great or this and that, it doesn't matter. It doesn't change how I feel about it. It's how you relate to your own voice is actually in your head. It's really just about your own relationship with it. So I'm still working on that aspect, to be honest. But again, I'm actually just proud that it doesn't have anything to do with the content, like you said, because I did read my own audiobook, but it's really just about the voice aspect of things, and I think it also speaks to this. I think the work of coming to terms with who we are, both in our past and who we want to be in the future, is ongoing work. The story never ends. And so while I may have come to terms with who I am on the page now, just the story aspect, I'm still working on listening to myself, actually in audio form. I'm still working on all these aspects that are new to me, and just being confronted with who we are is an ongoing process. And I think it's all situations through which we can learn more about ourselves, and actually to get our own voice of like what we think, who we want to be, and how we want to project ourselves. Like, actually.
Yeah, I mean, you never have to tell podcast hosts of the weirdness of listening to our own voice. Still bothers me. Kevin does a lot of the editing.
Yeah,
so
I have to listen to ourselves over and over and over. So I totally get what the struggle you're talking about.
Yeah.
There's this. We had this podcast host, Avery Truffleman, on our first season. She's this legendary podcast host. She's amazing, and she told us this phenomenon of podcast hosts where if you listen to the beginning of a podcast and you like skip like a year or 6 months in or whatever, all podcast voices, no matter how old they are, gets deeper. They all deepen their pitch. Happened to us. No one knows why.
How would you say? I'm totally curious. Please tell me how is your relationship with your own voice?
Oh, I've never listened to this show before. No. No. I think it helps when we have really amazing guests, and it helps because I'm always very focused on them. Even listening back, it pushes the blame. I mean, most of it's me. Like, I should have asked that better. That was too short. And Kevin also cuts a lot of things out.
Yeah.
But it's gotten better for sure. I think the excitement of it and the guests of it, and the more you listen to it, the more desensitized you get of it. And this is another. We've had great mentors for the show, podcasters, and they remind us we're characters. We're characters in this, right? And we just kind of have to remind that's the character, and kind of have to lean in. We've definitely had friends though who won't listen to the show, and I'm asked why, because they're like, "What?" I try to talk back, and I'm like, "Well."
Okay.
So it's this weird thing. I mean, I'm not fully used to it, but
Yeah.
I'm trying.
But little different story for me since I do most of the editing, so I hear everybody's voices. I actually have to listen to what we're talking about. It's definitely difficult. I think like there's a good 3-month period where I'm just judging my voice so hard. You kind of just get used to it.
We're desensitized.
Yeah, which I guess it's an interesting thing because we also talked to a neuroscientist about the differences between Zoom conversations and in-person conversation because of the effect of the pandemic is when we're on Zoom, we see ourselves, right? We know what we look like. And because a part of our brain is hardwired to like recognize faces, we cannot stop paying attention to our own face when we're on Zoom. As a result, Botox sales was through the roof during the pandemic.
Well, it's just so interesting.
Mhm.
Like both of you, have this like self-talk, but I will say that like, I listen to a lot of podcasts. Almost never have I been like, wow, their voices sound weird. Never.
Exactly.
But like, so I don't judge other people,
Mhm.
but like I judge myself, and I
Exactly.
think we all do. And it's just so interesting to me.
Exactly. I mean, it's always positive. Like, I hear Neil Gaiman on a podcast, and like, that voice cuts like butter. I just want to listen to him narrate my life.
Yeah.
But yeah, moving on. Having both written and narrated your book, have you find yourself speaking to yourself differently now that you have the story written down and published?
Well, to be fully vulnerable, I still struggle with issues of perfectionism. I just like, there's just so much, my therapist calls it negative self-talk that, I just like, I'm always trying to achieve this standard that like, it's not only unachievable, but like no one else knows that I have that standard but me. And so like, it's not even, I would say my perfectionism is not so externally driven. Like, oh, somebody else is going to think it's actually just like, I feel like a failure if I didn't achieve this like random goal that I set for myself. And, Gaurav and Kevin, you were mentioning like, it's also like, oh, just not even in recorded situations, like in a conversation with somebody, like, oh, I should have said that better. It's like, it doesn't matter at all, like it, to the situation. And so my self-talk after this book really, really changed a little bit, less from the publication of it, but just from the writing of it. I could see just when I was writing those 2.5 years down that I was just so self-directed in all my criticisms and negativity. I mean, I blame myself entirely for my burnout for the first like 2 years. Just like, why are you not tough enough, Carrie? Like, how can you like work harder? Meanwhile, I was, as my therapist said, driving myself to death. Like my job was actually killing me. And I was like, what's wrong with me? So I think I learned to be more, I wouldn't even say it's love. I think it's more generous with my former self. I just let her be who she is. It's funny because a lot of my stories about other people trying to, I think, control me, whether that be my mom and dad or my relationship at that time, or my boss, in many ways, trying to control who I am, how I spend my time and what I do. And I realized that, my current self in the writing process, which was from 2020 to really 2023, Carrie 2020 to 2023 was trying to control who I was in the past. And, because I had this like, you're so dumb, you should have done this thing instead of that thing or whatever. And that is a control, and so I try to just be more generous with myself and with everybody, including other people in the book. Some of my coworkers, I would say, were at times less than helpful, but being generous toward them with the same generosity that I was trying to extend to myself meant understanding, maybe they were doing that because they were hurting as well. And they were going through some sort of difficult issue at work or in their personal life. And so my general talk, as it were, with anybody now is one really of more generosity rather than judgment.
No, that's amazing. I mean, the way writing this book changed how you see yourself, how you see your past, the overall narrative of it, why you went through it, and the people in the story as well. I mean, it's the important part of, even if you're not going to publish a book as amazing as yours, just taking time to reflect on your narrative and understanding that everyone's just trying their best.
Yes.
And taking the time to kind of frame it in that sense is so important. And I think there's so many amazing elements of your book. Kevin and I are both immigrants. We both moved to this country in college, and I'm from Canada, and my grandparents immigrated to Canada. So much of that story hit on us, and so much of the high performing story hit on us.
Well, thank you so much, Gaurav. And I think what my book is fundamentally about is what it means to be alive and a person in the current era. And it's one of, certainly work and high performance there. And we talked about, LinkedIn and, all these circles, but it's also like, as you were mentioning, the immigrant aspect is such an important part of not just who we are, but it affects our work choices and who we are at work and how we are perceived at work, and so I really wanted to write a book that kind of explored everything all together, and I'm just really happy and hopeful and encouraged that both of you responded well to my book.
Carrie, we have learned so many great stories and insights from you today. And for our closing segment, Suspenders, this is where we ask you a random fun question that's not related to anything whatsoever, and you can give us any answer you feel like. Question of the day is, what bends your mind every time you think about it?
Maybe just because we've been talking about stories so much, but this is the central thing I think about, is how people can have such good intentions. They mean well. I see them struggle to do well, and they just can't do the thing, or they just don't live out their values in reality, and I see everyone struggle with that. Like, I respect my boss in the book so much. I think he is an incredible person. And so many people ask me, well, why couldn't he just get you help? Like, he is a billionaire times over. Only he can answer that question. Only he can tell that story, but he couldn't. And so I think that is the story, right? Like, how we can intend to, and we have these good intentions to make the workplace a good place. And yet there's just something that blocks us from living that story in reality. And so it bends my mind, because I often think about, well, why can't something just be the case? And then I have to just acknowledge that can't be the case.
Welcome back to Top Hat. This is the part of the episode where we dissect and analyze and investigate some of the cool, interesting, epic, awesome, and insightful lessons we got from this week's expert storyteller. And this week's expert storyteller was Carrie Sun, who wrote this really vulnerable and raw and interesting memoir about the world of high finance. It was incredible to kind of see her perspective of this world and how she moved through it as an administrative assistant, as well as learn more about the world itself. One of the fun things I loved about her book was she talked about advising the TV show Billions, which is one of my favorite shows, because it gets deep into this world of high finance that we often don't get to see.
Well, Gaurav, this is definitely a really fun conversation. There's a lot to learn from Carrie's story. And something I really liked that we talked about is when she's reading a book, she would often turn to the author's bio first because that helps her understand the storyteller's own background experience. That in turn helps her connect with the story better because now she knows the author's perspective. And that is something we talked about quite often on this show is when you're telling a story, a lot of times you are, sharing a piece of yourself in creating that story. So if you're willing to make the extra effort to understand who the storyteller is, how they got to where they are, it helps you better understand the reason why they're telling us the story in this way. I think that's just a cool lesson and something I'm going to try doing more when I read books in the future.
Yeah, this book was so much about perspective, right? And Kev, we were a little nervous about this interview because it is such a raw and vulnerable book, right?
It's a
And
lot.
we're talking to a storyteller who didn't just create a world; she lived it. She went through it. This is her journey, right? So asking questions about storytelling was a little nerve wracking, but she was so kind and so generous with her messaging, and she had an immense respect for storytellers. Kevin, you give me shit all the time about doing homework before we see a comedian. But it is that interesting thing where when you understand their story better, when you understand their background better, you can understand who the storyteller is and how they got to where they are. So, not only reading the bio, but not skipping the epilogue, letting them frame the story so you can connect with them better. It's an interesting way to get a better understanding of storytellers. I mean, and speaking of this, one thing really unique about this book was it is about high finance. It is about extremely rich people. It's about successful people, but it's from her perspective. And there are very few business finance type books where aren't written by the CEO, the guy everyone looks up to, the person we all pay to go see. And I love some of those books, right? But it's so interesting to learn about a journey from someone who's working within the system and trying to navigate it and figure it out. So I loved finding that niche in storytelling, and I think that the storytelling lesson here is there's a couple key ones there. One, niches are interesting. There's so many gaps in storytelling still, right? In the business finance world, there was a gap for people in the company moving through it. And also, your story matters. Your perspective matters. It doesn't matter if you're not the richest or the most powerful. Your story can have an impact on people because, in reality, a story like this will probably resonate with more people because more people are going through similar or connected things. We talked about this on the very first episode of this show. Your story matters, your story is interesting, and your story can impact a lot of people. So don't devalue it because you think you haven't accomplished that big thing that's going to give value to your story.
And I agree. Something we also talked about is sometimes it's not the accomplishments, the stuff you can put on your resume that makes for the fascinating stories. It's the moments of struggles and the entire journey that you take on to navigate those struggles. Those are the parts where you need to get vulnerable, but will ultimately make a compelling story out of. And one other thing that was great to learn about is an important principle that Carrie talked about in terms of drafting the memoir is you got to really protect your own memories.
Yeah, I mean, owning your story is so important. Facing your past is so important. We talk about this a lot on the show as well. We over index on stories. We over index on the one in a million story. And through like LinkedInification of our lives, through social media, through the movies we consume, the content we consume, we have a kind of a mismatched view of the world, right? And it allows us to judge our own stories when everyone's story is messy, everyone's story is curvy, has made a ton of mistakes in their life. So owning your story, facing your story, understanding that just made you more of who you are and get here is so important. Facing your memories, being honest with yourself about them, and forgiving your past self. That's one of these cool things about this book. She faced it, she was honest about it, and she made art out of it. Even if you don't write a book, even if you're just journaling, it's so important to own your story and say, this is who I am, this is how I got here, what now?
Yeah, I think Carrie's story is a great example of how the process of storytelling in itself is a great story too. But otherwise, this has been another great episode of the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast. If you like our content, make sure to subscribe and follow wherever you listen. Leave us a comment and a review to let us know what you're thinking. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok at LSPTpod, LinkedIn, Linen Suit and Plastic Tie.
Everyone's story is unique. Everyone's story is powerful. Your story is incredibly impressive. And today you took some time to learn how to speak to yourself a little bit better, how to own your story a little bit better. We appreciate everyone who gave us their time today. Have a good one.